The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines.
They called it a lockdown, but it wasn't about safety anymore. It was about control. In 2020, when the world shut down, so did America's prisons. But behind those walls, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. Inmates at USP Florence, San Quentin, and other maximum security prisons were sealed in their cells for weeks. No showers, no fresh air, no human contact. Officials said it was for health. But leaked reports and testimonies from guards told another story, one of starvation, brutality, and punishment disguised as protection. This is what really happened inside America's most brutal lockdown.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
March 2020. The world outside was shutting down, but inside the walls of America's toughest prisons, things turned darker. When COVID-19 hit, wardens across the nation ordered a total lockdown. Inmates at USP Florence were told it would last a few days. It didn't. Doors slammed. Lights dimmed. The air grew thick with fear and sweat. Each man was trapped in a 7 by 12 foot box, 2 bunks, 1 toilet, no ventilation. Meals were dropped through slots like feeding an animal. Cold bologna, dry bread, powdered juice. Sometimes, nothing. No phone calls. No visits. Not even the daily 1-hour recreation in the yard. For weeks, inmates screamed through the vents for answers. But the only voices they heard were guards shouting, "Lock it down." That first week, tensions boiled. Fights erupted between cellmates. Some guards used pepper spray and flashbangs, even though the men couldn't leave their cells. In San Quentin, the situation spiraled further. Reports later confirmed that guards transferred infected inmates into clean blocks, spreading the virus to hundreds. By the end of the month, the word lockdown had lost its meaning. This was something else. Something designed to break people. It started with a memo, a single piece of paper taped to a prison wall. Effective immediately, total facility lockdown. At USP Florence, guards moved fast. Within an hour, every door clanged shut. Inmates were ordered to return to their cells. Some thought it would last a day, maybe 2. They were wrong. Days turned into weeks. The lights stayed on 24 hours a day. The air was heavy, the smell unbearable. Sweat, metal, and disinfectant. The only movement came from guards sliding food trays through slots. Cold sandwiches. Powdered milk. Sometimes, nothing at all. In San Quentin, chaos erupted as guards tried to separate sick inmates from the healthy ones. But in their rush, they mixed them together. Within days, the virus spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. Dozens of men started coughing, begging for medical attention. The staff said they were shorthanded. The isolation was total. No phone calls. No yard time. No showers. Some inmates resorted to washing their faces with water from the toilet just to feel clean. Inside one block, a fight broke out over a piece of bread. 2 men, both covered in tattoos, sharing a 7 by 12 foot cell for 20 hours a day. After that, the guards stopped handing out full meals altogether, claiming the kitchen was under quarantine. As the days passed, the noise changed. At first, it was yelling, curses, metal clanging, anger. Then it became silence. A silence so deep that even the guards began to whisper when they walked the halls. A former correctional officer, who later resigned, described it as watching men disappear in plain sight. By the end of that first month, every inmate understood something terrifying. This wasn't just about a virus. It was about control. In every prison, food is power. And during the lockdown of 2020, it became the most effective weapon of control. At USP Florence, inmates used to line up 3 times a day for meals. It was routine, noisy, tense, but predictable. When the lockdown began, that stopped. Meals were no longer cooked fresh in the cafeteria. They were rationed, bagged, and delivered cold. At first, trays came twice a day, small sandwiches, a spoonful of beans, and a slice of bread. By the 3rd week, some cells received only 1 meal a day. No explanations. No complaints allowed. A correctional officer later revealed that food distribution was intentionally inconsistent. Some cells got extra portions, others got almost nothing. The goal wasn't nutrition, it was domination. Starvation made men obedient. Inside those cells, hunger changed everything. Arguments broke out over crumbs. One inmate hid a slice of bread under his mattress. His cellmate found it and beat him unconscious. In another block, two men traded soap for crackers through the air vents. Soap became currency. Food became survival. The guards watched it happen. Some laughed. Others looked away. When prisoners banged on doors, shouting for food, guards sprayed mace into the cells instead of answering. The official reason: maintaining order. In San Quentin, the situation was worse. A leaked report later confirmed that staff shortages and panic led to sustained food deprivation. Prisoners went up to 40 hours between meals. One man said, "We stopped thinking about time. We just waited for the sound of footsteps. That meant food." But sometimes, those footsteps didn't bring trays. They brought punishment. Inmates who shouted too loud were written up for disruption. The penalty? No meal delivery for the next round. They called it temporary isolation discipline. In reality, it was a slow breaking of the human mind. After 2 months, starvation started showing on faces. Cheeks sank. Eyes darkened. Some men fainted when standing. A few refused to eat altogether, a silent protest. They wrote messages on toilet paper. "We're human too." But no one read them. A whistleblower later testified that administrators purposely downplayed food shortages to the press. When asked how inmates were fed, the official report said, "All meals delivered as required." No one mentioned that, as required, sometimes meant one meal every 36 hours. In the lockdown system, hunger became obedience. A full tray was a privilege, a message that silence earned rewards. And the guards made sure everyone understood it. One inmate, a former gang leader from California, said in a recorded letter to his sister, "They control us with bread now. You talk, you starve. You stay quiet, you live." That line would later become a quiet symbol among prisoners who survived 2020. Whispers passed cell to cell. Bread means obedience. By midsummer, health reports showed alarming weight loss across facilities. At USP Florence, over half the inmates had lost between 15 to 30 pounds. At San Quentin, medical logs recorded dozens of cases of dizziness, dehydration, and collapse. But paperwork rarely matched the truth. Many incidents were never logged. The guards weren't monsters, some hated what they saw. One officer confessed later, "We were told not to question orders. If we handed out extra food, we'd be written up." It was a system, a cruel one. In the silence of that lockdown, food became language. A crust of bread left on a slot meant apology. A piece of fruit shared through a vent meant trust. And when someone gave away their last portion, it meant they'd given up. Inside those walls, control wasn't about weapons or chains. It was about who decided who got to eat. When the lockdown finally began to ease, the damage was already done. Bodies were thinner. Minds were fragile. But something deeper had shifted. Men who once fought each other now whispered across vents, bound by hunger and survival. For them, the lockdown wasn't just about losing freedom. It was about losing dignity. And when food became a tool of punishment, humanity disappeared from the system that claimed to rehabilitate. That winter, a correctional captain at one of the affected prisons summed it up in a single line during an internal briefing. "We didn't just lock the doors. We starved the noise out." The noise, of course, was human suffering. And silence was victory. Isolation is a weapon. And during the 2020 prison lockdowns, it was wielded with precision. Inmates at USP Florence and San Quentin were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, 1 hour outside. That was often spent alone in an empty yard, under watchful eyes, with no human contact. The human mind is not built for this. Days blurred into nights. Hours melted into weeks. Some prisoners couldn't remember the last time they'd spoken more than a few words. Leaked reports and testimonies from former guards described the effects: paranoia, panic attacks, depression. Men who had never feared their own thoughts suddenly became prisoners of their own minds. One inmate, a gang member with tattoos covering his arms and neck, wrote in a letter smuggled to his lawyer, "I'm losing myself. The walls are closing in. I see shadows in the corners of my cell that aren't there." Sleep patterns fractured. Many couldn't distinguish day from night. Fluorescent lights stayed on for 24 hours, bathing cells in cold, harsh light. Some men stayed awake for days, hallucinating voices, imagining threats in every sound. Suicide attempts rose. In some blocks, guards found men trying to cut themselves with broken pieces of tray or sink edges. Those who resisted the urge to self-harm often turned aggression inward, beating themselves or pacing endlessly. The term SHU syndrome became common among prison psychologists, the slow mental erosion caused by solitary confinement. Guards noticed subtle changes. One officer recalled, "Some guys would stare at a corner for hours, muttering to themselves. We'd check on them, but there was nothing we could do. Isolation does that to you." Men with histories of gang activity or violence were particularly vulnerable. Tattoos, once symbols of pride and identity, became reminders of a life that felt distant and unreal. Communication with other inmates was almost non-existent. Whispers through vents became lifelines. Some devised signals, a tap pattern on walls, a light reflection from a spoon, anything to know they weren't completely alone. Violence, too, wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Some guards used fear as a tool. A sudden door slam, a shouted command, flash of a baton. The message was clear: the world outside your cell doesn't exist. Only the rules imposed on you matter. The mental toll was staggering. One study cited by former correctional staff suggested that after just 30 days in near-total isolation, cognitive function declines dramatically. Memory falters. Emotional regulation deteriorates. Social skills vanish. Prisoners reported hearing voices, seeing figures that weren't there, and feeling a constant presence behind them, a shadow they couldn't escape. Gang leaders who once commanded respect now found themselves fearful of their own thoughts. Yet, even in the darkness, some adapted. Some wrote poems or letters they couldn't send. Others developed mental routines, counting tiles, memorizing cell patterns, creating imaginary conversations. These small acts of resistance helped them survive. But for many, the breakdown was inevitable. A guard at San Quentin said in testimony, "We weren't prepared for the psychological fallout. We were just trying to keep order, but the men were dying mentally." Isolation wasn't just punishment. It was a weapon designed to strip men of identity, pride, and humanity. By the end of the lockdown, dozens of inmates had been hospitalized for severe mental distress. Some were transferred to psychiatric units. Others were left in their cells, waiting for a system too overwhelmed to help. And the scars lingered long after the doors reopened. Men who walked out of lockdown were changed. Anxiety, distrust, and hypervigilance became permanent. Former gang leaders hesitated to speak, fearing retaliation from imagined threats. Inmates who once thrived on social hierarchy now retreated into silence. Psychologists describe it as a long shadow, the effects of isolation echoing years later. For some, the lockdown of 2020 was not just a chapter in prison history. It was a fracture in their minds that would never fully heal. Lockdowns were supposed to protect, but in reality, they gave some guards unchecked power. And in prisons like USP Florence and San Quentin, that power often turned violent. When inmates were confined for 23 hours a day, even small infractions became punishable. A misplaced blanket, a tap on the cell wall, a question asked too loudly. The punishment? Sometimes physical, sometimes psychological, always humiliating. Leaked testimonies from former officers paint a grim picture. Inmates were beaten for refusing orders. Some were dragged from cells and thrown to the floor. Guards wielded batons, chemical sprays, and even metal shields against men already weakened from hunger and isolation. In one cell block at USP Florence, an inmate refused to accept a cold tray of food slid through the slot. The response? He was pepper sprayed inside his own cell. Another man, tattooed across his arms and neck, was hit repeatedly for yelling to his cellmate through the vent. In San Quentin, reports described excessive use of force during lockdown. Inmates who refused to return to cells after yard time were restrained in handcuffs and leg irons, left in painful positions for hours. Some were placed in solitary confinement for days as punishment, essentially doubling the isolation. The violence wasn't always visible to the outside world. Cameras often didn't cover the worst areas. What remained were stories, whispered through vents or recorded in smuggled letters. One inmate wrote, "They don't just lock the doors. They lock us inside our pain. and then watch us break. Guards claimed they were maintaining order, but internal investigations later revealed that excessive force was routine, not exceptional. Beatings became a method of teaching obedience. A broken spirit was easier to control than a strong one. Even small acts of defiance drew punishment. A tattooed inmate who refused to bow his head during a cell inspection was slammed against the wall. Another, who attempted to cover up gang markings on his arms, was dragged to a medical area and threatened with solitary. Some officers tried to resist the brutality. One whistleblower said, "We saw what was happening and couldn't stop it. If you intervened, you'd be written up, suspended, or worse." The system protected the ones using force, not the ones suffering it. The fear of violence became part of the daily rhythm. Inmates learned to obey without question. A guard's shadow passing a cell could stop conversation. A baton resting against the wall was enough to silence an entire block. Gang hierarchies, too, were affected. Leaders who once demanded respect found themselves vulnerable. Tattooed men who had once controlled blocks now crouched on bunks, avoiding eye contact with guards and waiting for punishment to pass. And yet, some resisted. A few attempted small rebellions, banging on doors, refusing trays, writing letters of protest. The cost was high: immediate beatings, loss of privileges, extended isolation. But these acts became symbols among prisoners. A quiet message that even in total lockdown, some refused to give up entirely. Medical reports from the lockdown period confirmed hundreds of injuries caused by force, many unrecorded officially. Bruises, sprains, chemical burns from pepper spray, all hidden behind locked doors. A culture of silence ensured that the brutality was rarely seen by outsiders. By the time the lockdown eased, the psychological scars of the beatings were evident. Even those who survived without physical injury were hyper-aware of guards' movements. Tattooed arms and necks, once symbols of pride, became targets for aggression and reminders of vulnerability. For inmates, the lesson was clear: survival depended on obedience, silence, and endurance. The lockdown wasn't just a quarantine. It was a demonstration of absolute authority. The lockdowns of 2020 broke more than routines. They tested the limits of human endurance, mind and body. Yet, somehow, some men survived. Inmates at USP Florence, San Quentin, and other maximum security prisons had to adapt to a new, terrifying normal. Hours stretched endlessly. Walls felt closer with each passing day. Hunger gnawed, and the fear of violence never fully left. But survival demanded strategies. Some created mental routines, counting tiles on walls, memorizing every crack and vent in their cell. Others focused on small victories, finishing a meal, surviving the night, sending a smuggled note to family or lawyers. Whispers through air vents became lifelines. Tap patterns, coded messages, and small acts of defiance reminded them they were not entirely alone. Gang hierarchies shifted. Leaders who once demanded respect now relied on stealth and observation. Tattooed arms and necks, symbols of power, became tools of communication and survival rather than intimidation. Some inmates formed alliances through whispered vent conversations, sharing small scraps of food, offering support during panic attacks, or even just acknowledging another's existence became acts of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. But the physical and mental toll was visible. By the time lockdowns eased, inmates were thinner, frilier, and emotionally raw. Psychologists and medical staff documented severe anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Even months later, former prisoners described nightmares, hypervigilance, and distrust of authority. The families outside watched from a distance, unaware of the true severity. Letters arrived late, often censored. Phone calls were limited. Communication was a lifeline that barely existed. Some inmates tried to rebuild. They returned to normal prison routines with caution, avoiding confrontation. But others carried the trauma silently, retreating into themselves. The lockdown had left permanent marks, both visible and invisible. In the wake of these events, a few courageous guards and whistleblowers came forward to reveal the truth. Their testimonies exposed systemic failures, excessive force, starvation tactics, and the psychological damage caused by prolonged isolation. Investigations followed. Policies changed. But for many, the experience could never be undone. And yet, the human spirit endured. Some men found ways to reclaim dignity in small acts, teaching younger inmates, mentoring, or simply surviving another day. Tattooed arms, once symbols of gang allegiance, became silent markers of resilience. The lockdowns of 2020 revealed the fragility of control and the resilience of those under it. Inmates survived hunger, brutality, and psychological warfare, not because the system cared for them, but because they refused to let it break them completely. America's prisons are often hidden from the public eye. During the 2020 lockdowns, the walls of USP Florence and San Quentin became more than barriers. They became battlegrounds of mind, body, and spirit. What we've seen here is not fiction. It is a record of human endurance in the face of fear, hunger, and cruelty. Some survived. Some changed forever. And through it all, one truth remains clear. Even behind the darkest walls, the human spirit can endure, if only to whisper that survival is possible.